There are quite a few ways to add elements to the DOM. In this example, we have 3 empty sections and a template tag that we'll look at briefly, and some basic styling to differentiate between our template tag and future elements. We'll start with the most basic concept, and that is creating an element and appending it to the parent. So far, we have our sections cached up at the top. We also have some data that we'll use to insert some live data into our strings that we're passing into the DOM, just to simulate what an actual UI would be like. The first technique we're going to use is create element and append child. We do this in a few ways. The first of which is by actually creating a new element to insert in. In this case, we're going to insert a paragraph. The document object has a create element method on it, and we just pass in the type of element to create. You could change this to div, section, main, span, any valid HTML element, or technically invalid ones as well, but stick with the valid ones. The next thing we'll do, in this case, we're only inserting text. So I'm going to target the text content of that new element that we are creating. And I'll just set this to a string that says, this uses create element. And then I'm going to append some data. And this format is kind of tedious with the concatenation of a bunch of variables and strings together. Next, I've created this, but it's not actually in the DOM yet, and you'll notice down in our preview that nothing's there. So I need to actually target that first section, which is 0 in our array of sections. And I'm going to do append child, and I'll append that paragraph. And it's not working because I made a slight typo, and this is content. And now we see that this has been appended to that first section. So that's our first technique. You can do variations on this technique. For example, your text content could instead be a template string that we're going to look at in a moment. Instead of append child, which adds this paragraph to the end of any other content inside of that section, you could also do one of the insert adjacent HTML techniques, which will all be linked to in this activity. The next one is using inner HTML and template strings. This is perhaps one of the easiest and most straightforward techniques. It uses a few modern things like template strings. But for this, all we're going to do is set up a new variable. I'll just call it HTML. And I'm using backticks. These are the things that look just like apostrophes, but they're facing the opposite way. You can find them on your tilde key. And this is called a template string. And template strings allow you to insert variables directly into them using a syntax that we'll look at in a second. So right in here, I'm going to actually place a paragraph and say this is a template string. And I can immediately target that data from earlier without having to close out my string, open it again, and so on and so forth, just by using the syntax of $, and then curly braces on each side. I'd actually insert this into the DOM. We'll target sections. We'll target this second section with 1 because it is the second location in the array. And we'll use inner HTML, and we'll set that equal to HTML. And we can see that that has been inserted in. Notice that the syntax for inner HTML is different from what we're accustomed to. All of our other techniques are using methods. Inner HTML is just a property, and we're changing the HTML of that. So in this case, this actual paragraph with the string inside of it is being turned into HTML in the DOM. So it'll render out just like any normal HTML would. It's not going to render out the P and any other elements as strings. The final way is a little more complex, but utilizes an option that allows us to actually write our HTML in the HTML and then modify in the JavaScript. So on this side, you see that I have a new element called template. And template is invisible to the page until you actually drop it in somewhere else. So in this case, we have template, and I've given it an ID so I can target it. And I just have some markup in here. I've got 2 horizontal rules and a paragraph with a class on it. And this class is styled with our CSS in a certain way. In order to actually make use of this, we have to do a few things. We have to capture the template itself. We have to make a copy of it. And then we have to target any of the elements inside that we want to modify. So it is a little more tedious, but does allow us some additional freedom as well as keeping all of our HTML in the HTML. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll target the template. And it has an ID of user template. And then I'll also clone that template. And I'm cloning it with something called import node. And you can actually use import node on anything, on any element in the DOM. So if you had, say, a list item and you wanted to add another list item that had all the same structure, you could use import node to do that. What this is going to allow us to do is, if we were to modify template directly, we would be modifying this content here, but instead we want to make a copy of it that doesn't modify the initial and then drop that into the DOM somewhere else. So I'll do import node, and the syntax here is that we're going to target the template itself, so template, and then its content. We're also going to pass in a second argument of true. The second argument is a Boolean value that is instructing import node to either do a deep clone or a deep import or a shallow import. And all that means is that if this were set to false or nothing, it would only capture the outer content of this. It wouldn't actually drill down and grab our HR and our paragraph and our other HR. From here, we now want to target this paragraph because that's where we're going to put our content. So we'll do const target equals clone dot query selector. Remember that you can use query selector on any DOM node, not just the document itself. And we'll target user data. And from here, we can use any of the previous techniques to do what we want here. So we already have a paragraph. I'm going to be lazy and just do inner HTML because it's pretty easy. And I'll use my template string again. And I can still access that data. And finally, we need to now take our clone itself and drop it into the DOM. So we can do this either with inner HTML on that third section, or we can do it with append child on that third section, or any of the previous techniques. So let's go ahead and just do sections2.append child clone. And we'll see that we have all of the markup from inside our template, including those 2 horizontal rules, as well as a styled p tag with our content.